Okay, so maybe you've experienced this, but a few programs are experiencing a little bit of economic constriction, right? So this next question speaks to this. What are the non-negotiables, the must-haves? Not the nice-to-haves, not the wish-to-haves, but the non-negotiables that you need to have a program that's really delivering high-quality higher education for adult non-traditional learners. Bottom line, what do you have to have?
Look to David, because I have a hard time distinguishing between non-negotiable and desirable.
Desirable is next. So I'm going to give you a chance to talk about desirable, but this is the bottom line. David.
So there's a bunch of material things especially having to do with cost and support that we should talk about. But just as a way of saying, kind of for me, what's at the heart and to prompt the conversation, I would say that it is a climate and a culture and a material infrastructure of welcome, of relentless welcome, both in terms of mentoring and advising and faculty who are not only skilled and passionate teachers, but understand their students. I would bundle all those under the phrase vertical welcome, welcome between students and their mentors and teachers. And equally important, horizontal welcome, a peer community in which students will not let each other fail and take joy in each other's success. And it's actually the programs represented in this room that I know have been talking about. Because in doing field work as I became passionate about this, I went to places where I saw what it means to have a peer community of student support. And I've ended up thinking, and that doesn't tend to get talked about a lot. We talk a lot about advisement and mentoring, and all of which is essential. But I would say that peer-to-peer support is probably the single most important secret sauce.
And on my list, I have that as caring relationships across everything, everybody. I would add assessment of prior learning as a non-negotiable for adult learners, and I would add some kind of multiple pathways to getting to the same outcome or the same credential, if that's where they're aiming, and adult-friendly policies.
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
But I'd also note another thing that I've learned in working with the programs and colleges in this network is those virtues, those strengths can actually take wildly different design features. From the competency-based curriculum of School for New Learning to the organize everything around your capstone project of College Unbound. And the possible diversity of design that can fulfill those commitments and values is an important takeaway.
I like the idea of the relentless welcome is capturing within it the honoring of experience that comes within PLA, the respect for the learner, as well as where they want to go. I have an ongoing, persistent, nagging question about that, which is it scalable? Or does it require a small school environment of some sort? This is to you, David, the vertical and the horizontal.
So I think that it can be scaled out, but not scaled up. In other words, I think there is a kind of a natural compactness, because even though I think we can do very, very creative things with digital platforms of learning, in the end, that culture of care and welcome that we've all been talking about requires an anchor in face-to-face relations. And I often think about the metaphor of the Carnegie libraries as a helpful metaphor. Andrew Carnegie transformed the library landscape of the United States by scaling out tons of small community-based libraries. And his goal was not to create big 42nd Street mega libraries, except in big mega cities. I think that ought to be our metaphor for scaling.
So now you can have your cake and eat it too. In addition to these non-negotiables, what are to make something truly excellent? What else do you feel like you need? Catherine?
Well, I think it ranges from having institutional commitment, so that we're not just having the blessing and the burden of being the adult-focused program or college or even institution. But what keeps coming back to me, and maybe this is because this is where I'm spending more of my own time and passion and energy, is around equity and what David was referring to as democracy. I think back to the students that I was involved with back in the 70s, and our dean at that time referred to them as the lunatic fringe. And I think she meant the staff, actually. But what I have come to appreciate about our School for New Learning students, whether they're in banking or construction or working in a community agency, is that many of them have such a strong commitment to bettering their communities, the lives of people around them, so that I have really come back to what I think makes for excellent programs, is to include, incorporate in some way that notion of how are we serving the world around us, and that whether we call it equity or democracy or community engagement, I think it is I think that's what higher learning is for, one of the things that higher learning is for.
Well, and adults live in communities, right? They're already engaged and entwined within their communities, so they're motivated.
I'd second the importance of institutional support, and I think we're going to need to talk about this because I know from the surveys how many of you mentioned the sense of marginalization of your programs within institutions. But I want to go from that very specific and important point to a more grandiose one. The Benjamin Mays, the former president of Morehouse, the mentor of Dr. King, who was a graduate as an adult non-traditional student of Bates College, where I spent a lot of years, because Bates had a tradition of racial inclusiveness since its founding. In his memoir, he tells a wonderful story about when he left the Jim Crow South in the 1920s to come to Bates. It was the first place that he had been treated with respect by white people. And when he was called the N-word one day in the dining hall, immediately the students and staff crowded around and schooled and shamed the person who had done that. And he says, it was the first time I ever felt at home in the universe, which I find very moving. It seems to me that that's actually as good a distillation of what great education should be, to help students feel at home in the universe. And it's partly about the kind of engagement in the world beyond yourself that Catherine just said. But it's also equally having permission to be curious, intellectually engaged, emancipated intellectually as a learner. And that's also, along with all these other things, I think a condition of excellence. In the wider discourse about adult learners and higher education, maybe the thing that makes me most angry is when people condescend to the goals and aspirations of adult learners and don't accord them the right to that kind of self-emancipation intellectually. And good policies as well.
And not just consent, but assume it's not a desire. You know, every student I talk to wants to be challenged, wants to transform themselves and their communities, and is stretched incredibly thin and trying to do it and, you know, make it through to next week too. So we have been very good in that we've got through the set questions. So I want to open the conversation. I'm going to turn my alarm off so it doesn't go off. But I want to open it to questions. I could ask them more questions, but that's a little selfish of me. It's kind of obnoxious. So if you could just stand up, I think, and when you speak your question, that will help make sure everyone can hear it. And then if I remind you to read, yes, thoughts and comments too. And feel free to challenge these lovely folks because everyone likes to be challenged. And I want to remind you to just repeat the question into the microphone after you hear it. Akila.
Yeah, I didn't think I heard it, but you didn't say anything about faculty as far as desirable or non-negotiable. So I was wondering your thoughts about what does faculty look like, what should they look like, what could they look like, what's the non-negotiable?
Okay, so I think your question, first of all, this is Akila Martin from SNL DePaul. She came a little late, so y'all didn't get to meet her earlier, but she's wonderful. And I think, Akila, your question is, what's a non-negotiable for the kinds of faculty that you want teaching in these programs, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Well, I think a non-negotiable for all students is to be taught and mentored by a faculty who understand their lives, who as a whole faculty community share their experience as well as going beyond their experience. And I think for adult non-traditional students, that means in particular faculty who have paid attention to the lives of their students, who in the mix of the faculty community can draw on their own experience so that students, we often use the phrase, students need faculty who look like them, and I think that's true, but also who have lived like them. But again, I would say who can help. The ideal of being able to be at home in the universe is both an ideal for students of being able to be at home, and so faculty need to be able to share that sense of home, but also being at home anywhere, even beyond the worlds that you came from. And I would say faculty who can mix both of those forms of welcome are key.
And let me say that I want to kind of break down here the little spatial construction and invite other folks in the audience to throw in your responses to the questions as well. Okay? They're plugged in, so I don't think we're not wireless exactly, so I think we are a little bit locked into this format for tonight at least. Judah, maybe you can help us with it. Be more flexible.
We definitely won't be in this format tomorrow.
Okay, thank
We'll have
you.
a mic that goes around.
Okay, thank you. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask why, when you bifurcated between the nice-to-haves and the non-negotiables,
Yeah.
that institutional support was a nice-to-have rather than non-negotiable.
My guess is.
I'm curious why.
Yeah. It depends how you interpret it. David's very evocative idea of the relentless welcome, I think, whether you include institutional support as a non-negotiable or not. Yeah.
Well, I think I responded to that from my personal experience. I've only worked in adult programs, focused programs, and we've always been somewhat on the fringe, on the periphery. So I have that sense of, we're going to do it, right? We would love commitment, and I think it's increasingly important that we have institutional institutional commitment and that we're really part of the fabric of the institution. I'm just used to doing it anyway.
That was exactly why I didn't include it. And I actually want to connect it to the question that Akila asked. I heard her asking about what is needed in the student-faculty relationship in terms of who faculty are, what they look like, and that's key. But we also need to say, what would a faculty culture and community look like in which the institution supports this kind of excellence?
And can I add that faculty, well-intentioned, committed faculty also need to be willing to step out of their own experience enough, because faculty, by and large, were good students who were rewarded and who therefore went on and got their advanced degrees, right? And they have, we need to rethink those kind of traditional patterns of delivering education, of things like this setup, right, with non-traditional learners. And so that requires stepping out of that experience, and it's very nerve-wracking, especially for new faculty to do that, because very few faculty have been taught how to teach. And when they have been taught how to teach, they've usually been taught a fairly maybe I TA'd for someone and they taught me how to deliver a lecture to 300 students, so that's just not going to help me. So that helping faculty realize that they need to be learners along with the students, and to step out of that their comfort zone and their relative privilege to the students, and see the students as peers and work with them it's really hard. And even people even me, I forget. It's very hard to keep reminding yourself of that, because this is the role that you've been playing and trained in. These are the scripts you've learned, and so you want to keep redoing it. Yeah, did you?
I'm just going to say, along the same lines, I don't have any numbers on this, but I suspect that the vast majority of faculty went through a very traditional undergraduate education.
Right.
They were undergraduates at 18 years old, and so they're probably not used to, at least from their own experience, having kids, having a job, and trying to keep up with all of these work and think, well, sure, you got to read the book.
Right.
I'm not saying that the learners don't read the book, but the expectations are a little bit different, because and I'll just speak for myself, went through a very traditional background without having kids while I was in college, without having worked a 40-hour-a-week job, and I think that's part of the adjustment too, to understand where our students are coming from.
Right, when I was a jerk when I first started teaching adult students, because I was like, you gotta do this, or else you're not really being a student, right? It was ridiculous, and very little of it was about learning, right? It was about, following the rules and so helping faculty to rethink that, while at the same time not going towards the kind of codependency role, faculty role, where, these poor students, poor thing, cut them slack, don't have to do as much, which does the student no good,
Right.
And doesn't give them the challenge that they are so thirsty for. So one of the saddest things I've been seeing, did all these interviews, and I've been coding the interviews, is when students are again and again feeling like they're not being challenged and they're ready to be challenged. So there's ways to challenge folks with learning that's not about checking boxes all over again. Yeah.
I think my question sort of builds off of that. Catherine, maybe in particular, you used the phrase adult-friendly policies, and I'm sure we'll be talking about that over the next couple of days. Mm-hmm. But can you lead us off with a few of your core thoughts on that idea?
Sure. I can give some examples that I think many policies that I'm familiar with are based on what a full-time student ought to be doing. And so when our adult students take longer than a quarter or longer than 2 quarters to complete a self-designed project, or finish up an incomplete, there's a certain period of time in which that grade turns to F. That one really bothers me. Because most students, in my experience, are not out dancing. You know, they're out living their lives and trying to negotiate very complicated lives. And then they're stuck with a grade of F, and they have to go through appeal process. It messes up their GPA. It puts their financial aid in jeopardy. So that's an example of a kind of policy that I think is not friendly, or the one that students, after 2 weeks, if they're in a course and something happens and they need to withdraw, they don't get their money back. Now that's a lot of money that they don't get back. It's not necessarily their fault that they went into the hospital or someone died. It's those kinds of things that are just not taking into account the reality, as we talked about, of the students' lives.
Also, limits on prior learning assessment. This often is related to the accrediting bodies, but it also is how you account the prior learning, and as well as transfer policies. Yeah.
So this is sort of an area, and I'd certainly be interested in anybody who's sort of thought about non-traditional student and the lessons maybe that we could take to younger populations who are now increasingly sharing a lot of characteristics with the non-traditional students. So at IU Kokomo, where I didn't know that we worked at the same place. At IU Kokomo, I mean, just an unbelievable number of our traditional age undergraduate students are working a full-time job, or they got 2 part-time jobs. Many have children. That, you know, this is not. I mean, I've been in a traditional, you know, more stereotypical setting, right? But that description that we have, that's been kind of bandied about, you know, higher education doesn't get this or that, you know, that sort of thing. That doesn't describe our institution really very well at all now. And so it seems to me like there's a lot of things that like we can learn from what's happening in terms of the non-traditional students, in terms of those same policies I hate when they affect the 19-year-olds.
Right, yeah, and with the costs of education, I mean, there's very few students, you know, who really can afford to work.
So I'd like to answer that in 2 ways. One is, I hope this doesn't sound nitpicky, I think it's quite important. You actually just described non-traditional students, I mean, those human individuals. Age is not a very good proxy for this. Yeah. So a 19-year-old who's a parent or who's working full-time fits into that description that we, and yes, they have different needs, they have different literacies, they probably have digital literacies that a 45-year-old office worker doesn't have, but they are already in the universe of what we're talking about. But it's also true, having said that I think much of what counts as great teaching and learning and as lousy teaching and learning and policy for this non-traditional majority is also can and should be imported to the way we think about education for traditional undergraduates. And I want to come back to the issue of failure that was sort of floating around in the last conversation. It seems College Unbound has a wonderful class called Learning from Failure. Reframing failure. It's a required class in the first year sequence, if I'm remembering right. And I think it's crucially important for especially non-traditional students who almost all normatively feel like they're embarrassed by their earlier relationship to education and feeling like they failed the normative script. But it's actually, I would argue, the place where faculty and mentors and all human beings, if they examine their own experience, even if they were fabulous little students all the way through, they have experiences of failure that need to be owned and learned from. And that I actually think is a place where the pedagogy of working with adult students, with non-traditional students, can connect with faculty and be open a door to traditional age students. And I think in all of those cases, for me, and again, I've learned this most of all from College Unbound, the pedagogy of failure and engaging failure and reframing failure is precisely about taking responsibility for your life. It's not about being treated as, having corners cut for you and being quote unquote coddled and not having grit and all this other bullshit. And in my experience, again, through these programs, the students who deal with that are hungry and empowered by the process of taking responsibility for what they want their education to be, and that's what gets them and faculty out of the box of feeling like they have to be, in some way dumbed down in their education. And that seems to be something that's the right way of saying this. There's no way of having great teaching and learning with non-traditional students and not confronting that issue. But that's a set of learnings that we need to take to traditional students as well.
And looking at the students in my little study, and a number of them became adult students because they experienced a failure and didn't know how to manage it, right? And so they started as first-time, full-time, but they didn't last. And it took them sometimes decades to come back. It becomes a huge monkey on their back. So I would say we should be teaching that in high school, grammar school, with 2 college-age kids of my own. I think it's vital. And I want to. I don't know if you do this at College Unbound, but I think it's as important to teach students about taking responsibility themselves as helping them analyze the context and the structures that they're negotiating. Because I've seen too many students who take everything upon themselves. We could argue that's not necessarily taking responsibility, but don't understand the power structures and the other structures that are in place, and aren't, having a critical lens to those can also be a very powerful tool in helping them to see their experience in a broader context and reevaluate their experience, and then use that as then a tool to go forward.
Yeah, I mean, just to be clear, because I don't think I was clear, that process of taking responsibility for laying claim to your education is the opposite of blaming yourself for your failures. It's learning how to lay claim to your life, and it's actually from working with these students that I went through my own process of introspection about that, so watching them do it.
Yes.
So, just an observation and a few questions. So, a lot of the ways a non-traditional student is different is because federal policy makes them different. Whether that term appears at all in federal policy, it guides everything from what the risk factors are to, you can tie from the risk factors from the 2002 study by the department that created the term non-traditional students to ability to benefit, right? And I just make the observation because I think everyone here probably knows that, but it's still a valid point that, we've designed the system at the highest level that pays colleges for what they should look like that are not designed to serve this particular kind of student. And it's specific, it's data-driven, and it's important to realize as we're trying to, if you look at, I'm a policy researcher, so all I think about is scale, unfortunately. And I keep thinking 36 million, some college, no credit. And how do we get from our conversation to educating that number of people? And that needs to be my questions. Does the same financial model that serves traditional students is that scalable to serve, even just using that 36 million as our universe? That's one. Two, the second question is related. I'm guilty of this too. When you write in a DC policy audience, all you ever write about is why, for jobs, people should get more education. And my personal experience when I started this work years ago, teaching ESL and all that, that's not all what the adult learners want anyway, and I'm trying to figure out is it possible to build from that narrative about jobs that I don't think you can get around, because it's what public policymakers want to hear. It's what they want to fund, whether it's a governor. Is it possible to build from that to the fuller, transformational, agentic kind of approach, self-awareness, self-emancipation that we're talking about here?
Can I just speak to that second one? I mean, it's for the jobs for tomorrow, not for jobs for today, right? If you just educate folks for jobs, it's for the jobs for today. They're not prepared for the jobs for tomorrow, for which they need that critical thinking, the ability to transform, the flexibility, and given what we know about the economy, it's extremely short-sighted to educate just for today's jobs. So you're just going to have it back in school again in another couple of years when all those folks get laid off. So I mean that certainly has been our argument with the educating folks in this much richer way.
I don't know much about scalable financial models, really. I've not been very successful at that part, but I was at another university a couple weeks ago, and that institution, which has certificates, bachelor's, master's, and doctorates, as an institution, has committed itself to transformative learning as its mission. So that institution is committed to having transformative learning being scalable. And when at my day-long session, the president was there, the vice president, the chief financial officer, academic advising, faculty. It was that whole stream of people who are responsible for student success and student learning. I don't know if that's what it takes, and I don't know how many places that's possible, but I was really heartened to see that example.
Terrific.
Yeah, one place that I've seen in
There you go.
many years. but very, very exciting.
I want to just underscore, Louis, that I want to piece apart what I hear of the two different questions or comments that you made. One was about policy, which I think you probably know the most of anyone in this room and have to deal with it every day. And I think you're underscoring something that's really an important challenge, which is how do we get beyond naming a list of piecemeal, infuriating policies, which Catherine did eloquently and rightly, to envisioning a policy regime that does not take the traditional student as the norm. And you helped me see that more clearly just now, about the way not just academic institutions, but the policy landscape defaults to them. We need to change that. And that, I would say, is different from the second question, which I heard as a strategy discourse question. How do we tell the story so that it starts from the current dominant discourse, which is an honorable one, about the need for economic security, but ties it, he says, there is no such thing as education for work in the longer run, which doesn't also do these other things, which is what Michelle was starting to open up. And I think we need to think in a big global way about both the policy and that discourse question. How do we talk about automation, and what it's doing to the division of labor and job availability in ways that doesn't just paralyze higher ed, but talks about what is our mission to create a human landscape.
Did you want to jump in on this?
I just want to follow up on the question and maybe ask a question back. So when you're asking about a financial model, like what is it that you have in mind? Like what's the challenge there, or what's the need there?
So the way we do Title IV financial aid right now is based on the idea of a fall semester and a spring semester. We added summer Pell, and you were able to do that only because you called it something like summer Pell, so that way people can still understand that, oh, we're still investing money in the fall semester and in the spring semester, terms which don't really mean a lot to adult students. And we're still, so we've structured a way that we pay as a society, and then colleges, the built infrastructure of delivery builds itself around that. And, are there better ways, just to throw out ideas that I've written about before, like do you use the tax code? Do you use Section 120? Is Section 127, which is about employer reimbursement of, is that a better place to begin? Do you fix that to serve a broader, the 36 million, instead of trying to fix Title IV? Because Title IV can't be fixed to deliver for this. I don't know. But I've been doing it long enough now to wonder if tinkering around Title IV, I don't know if it's going to get us to a model of financing education for the way that adult learners tend to learn over time when they take, not just 2 months to finish a project. And because that sets up a whole different structure of time that doesn't fit the Carnegie unit, which Title IV is built on the Carnegie unit.
Yeah.
And it's not, I just offer it because when I was saying to Adam earlier, like coming to a session for this for me is like reclaiming my soul, right? What I hear here is what I do not hear in DC about this amazing population of students, right? I hear creativity, I hear commitment, I hear passion, and we have to find a way to translate that into a way that can help us with policy.
I'm so curious about this, about the policy world, because non-traditional students are not new. Adult learners are not new. The commissions and reports and the Club of Rome and all these major studies and commissions that came out in the early 70s have not seemed to have had much impact on federal policy. And I'm wondering if they did at one time and we lost ground. What's your take on that?
The simplest reason is that there's no articulate constituency, right? So there's a whole middle class that supports the college going of 18-year-olds, right? Unionization for a while. Unions were an organizing force that could be a voice for adults that might choose to produce. There is not really an organized constituency that federal level. I worked at the state level for 15 years before I did federal policy, and even at the state level, it's largely a workforce issue there. And so, middle-class parents that want their kids, their 18-year-old, to go to college, make sure Pell is there. They make sure student loans are available, and they tell their congressman. That's a key issue. Other issues are that we haven't gathered, there hasn't been good data. At the federal level anyway, there's not really good data. We'll have better data soon. IPEDS is now tracking part-time students and non-first-time, non-full-time students. They hadn't done that, right?
Yeah.
So for the lens of the federal government, this student body didn't really even exist, because when the Congress makes policy, they turn to GAO and CBO looks at IPEDS. If IPEDS wasn't counting them, then you can't make policy based on this type of student. Those are the two big ones, though. It's that there's no constituency, organized constituency, that, the DC-based organizations, UPSEA, continuing ed, right? Kale is based here,
Yeah.
but the times that, so I worked with Kale about 5 years ago trying to get Title IV money, to pay for portfolio assessment.
Yeah.
People have no idea, like you go up to talk to staff on the Hill, they have no idea what you're smoking before you walk in there, right? They're just like, what the hell are you talking about?
Yeah.
Right? So anyway, I'll stop, but the political constituency is matters. Without it, there's no voice that's showing up all the time saying this is important and this matters. And then the data that make these students visible. The some college no degree students, iPads couldn't have produced that data. The National Student Clearinghouse produced that data, as more states have looked at them. And the reason I ask about financial model is because I spend a lot of time talking to schools about why they're pursuing adult students and why they pay marketing companies and enrollment management firms to find them. And that we're all talking about here today is not what they say. But they hire the marketing firms to help them find the students because they're looking for a cash cow.
Exactly.
And I don't think that's a recipe for serving the students well, actually. Thank you for listening.
Just on that note, George Mason is conflating online with adult.
Yeah,
Which,
a lot of
you know,
schools are.
and our students tell us they don't want online. I'm almost a one. But it's, yeah, that conflation of online is adult. It's like, not so much. So, sorry.
No, it's
infuriating.
Did you have?
I had some loose ends I wanted to just surface that it came out of everybody, but most recently Lewis. And this idea of policy and like living in this, to me, post-FIPSI world, I think is also important. Like so much change in higher ed was spurred by FIPSI dollars over the past 50 years that kind of seeded some of these ideas. So I'm curious about where innovation comes from that supports this. When we're talking about money and policy changes, it's federal policy, but it's also what you and I, David and others have written about, this other student debt. If we're working with adult learners that are taking credits and taking courses at multiple universities and not able to get their transcripts out, like, I don't know if this is a semantic shift or it's a larger policy shift, but who owns credits, I think is a really important one. And if I've been at a school for 3 years and I default on my last semester, I don't get any of those 3 years. I mean, that's bull. So how do we together do some of that? It's almost like local policy throughout our institutions to create different ways of functioning together. I think is really interesting of this group that then can influence larger policy. And then, to me, it's like, what does policy look like that's built on supporting failure and experimentation, rather than assuming what they want to call traditional success or the traditional student. And one of the things that distinguishes this group speaks to what David was saying about scale, is that we're thinking about scale differently.
Yep.
And I just want to get clearer and clearer over these next days about that language, about how we want to define these terms, like policy and like scale, and how we want to own them as a collective. And the one other thing I think I want to put maybe to this group, or maybe it's just over these next days, is that first question's about the aha moment, and I loved everyone's answers there. And when I think about the past decade of College of Marienau, I'm as much influenced by the amazing graduation when families are up there and the raising the roof, as you're saying, David, as I am about the, what I'm going to call like, oh no moments. Like when someone told me that College of Marienau shouldn't exist because those students don't deserve a degree. Like that motivates me as much as anything else. And so I guess I'm curious also in those oh no moments of what we're trying to challenge and push against, not just what we want to celebrate. And that's the failure stuff that I think we're all talking about.
I think can I piggyback on that? So Adam, you just, you added something to the kind of strategy, what do we do, how do we make change conversation, if I heard you right. What you added was a middle level scale that is larger than changing an institution the way Catherine was consulting that institution, all good, and utter systemic change, which is what Lewis was talking about. And I think it's really helpful to be reminded that change happens at different scales. Like the National Student Clearinghouse, which is a non-governmental systemic data gatherer. It doesn't have every college's data, but it has pretty damn near all of them, and that's a game changer because it helps, it let us know that there were 36 million some college no degree folks. And then at a smaller scale from that, there are large academic consortia, AAC and U advocating for liberal education, the competency-based network that DePaul's been involved with. I think what we need to figure out is what a kind of guerrilla group of 20 programs and institutions who have the advantage of actually being the best performing institutions in this space. Not just in terms of ethical and great teaching and learning, but in terms of completion rates that typically go beyond what the more famous adult online completion program. So we have some real assets at a scale that's collective but kind of compact. And what can we do with that? Could we model students owning their own credits and getting the institutions that our students come from and go to release transcripts even when they're small amounts of institutional debt. So I think these last 20 minutes are interesting because they're starting to get us to think strategically about what we could do together.
I like to think of the distributed network approach. Other questions? We've been having this conversation for a while. So those of you who are newer, questions, things that, let me just open up a little bit more. I know we did the survey, but things you want to make sure that we kind of get to in the next couple of days that you want to make sure we talk to. Yes.
I would be interested in hearing open-minded stories of admissions policy. Right now we have, I just had a 44-year-old lieutenant in the county police force just get asked on why he wasn't enrolled between 94 and 2015. And it may have had something to do with needing a job, I'm not sure. But literally, they're asking for essays to explain time periods of unenrollment.
Yeah.
And that's an attitude on an admissions part.
Yeah.
But it's like, okay, but so I'd like to hear some people who have some open-minded admissions departments that can oversee, because there is no educational or academic basis to ask somebody why they weren't enrolled. It's an economic reason or other.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that's what I'd like to hear from you.
I don't think that's necessarily admissions. I think that's a financial aid.
Not in this case, it's admissions.
But I think it's both.
Well, my wife is the director of financial aid at the university, so I'm good there. But it's the admissions, and it's specific. I mean, they're asking real.
So I think that's where your institution has to get together. Where we were already talking about having the persons involved, the administrative team. At our institution, I have everybody in a meeting with me when I have an issue with my adult learners, and I bring up the issue. We have our own admissions policies for our even and online students, and I created it so we can alleviate a lot of the barriers that adult learners have for enrollment period. So you have to bring in those because they're the ones that make it happen. And we are a small private institution, so we're able to make changes a lot quicker than public institutions, but you have to go to the top.
Right.
You have to go to the top.
I fully understood. I couldn't get our administrative building, somebody there to return an email to me, let alone have a meeting with them.
Which is a problem, which means we need to turn the table on them, because if it was a student, and a student wasn't emailing them,
Exactly.
then all, hell
I follow
would
you.
break
I follow you. No, there's a serious cultural issue
Correct.
with the institute. I mean, we have 5,000 students over 25 years old as undergrads.
Wow.
Okay, and so, but we're the only official adult degree completion program.
So you
And
need to
so-
show them do they see your numbers real time and
Oh.
what revenue is being brought in as a result?
It's
Because I know
a,
most of the revenue driven, unlike those of us that are here,
It's a
we are
complicated political issue because of the size of the university. But literally, we're getting pushback from admissions on individual students because we do our own prospecting, we do our own information sessions, we tell them when to apply after we've reviewed all their transcripts. So we know these people. And then admissions will come in because we can see we use Banner, so we can see when admissions has added comments like academically dismissed in 1985. Ooh. And so somebody who just retired from Lockheed Martin is mid-level HR. And so things like that, what we're seeing, admissions is trying to play gotcha on students, asking for essays and resumes, looking for reasons to exclude them. And so we have an institutional issue, so I'd like to see what other admissions policies look like that don't create this culture. I guess.
Yeah, so just on that note, you use the language, David, of policy regime, and there needs to be a shift in that. So I'd like to hear us talk more about what that shift would mean in practice, institutionally. And I think there's enough of us here that are aware, there's certain institutional, I don't know if there's goals or objectives or priorities that often come into conflict, with what you're talking about. So
I think that's on the commons and the parking lot. In other words, a theme that's simmering that we need to come back to.
Yeah, that's what I'm gathering right now. Adrian?
Mine may be more or less relevant as well, but to the degree that we're here as undergraduate and some of us with graduate programs, supports become even more scarce when you become a graduate student, and it does not mean that your needs go down. And there are increasingly these angel funds for undergrads, and what we're finding is that there is nothing for our grad students. And so it's not as if that transformational experience ends after you have the BA and now you're done and you're fully formed. And so to the degree that you want to continue to learn and grow, so just, and it speaks to, the whole Pell grant, all of that, TRIO, Pell, what else goes away and yet doesn't if you really want an education.
I think that's it. You're raising an issue that we're, at least speaking for me, I'm only just beginning to start thinking. So I'm listening to you and start trying to catalog and map where the issues are.
I mean, I can speak specifically. I have a student who has started this fall and is currently living in a homeless shelter. And she went to the emergency support program at our university and was told, we have funds for undergrads. And they don't have many funds, so that it's not, if there's a point at which I don't mean to point a finger in a negative way, but I'm pointing it more to say a systemic issue is going back to sort of what you were raising.
Did you have your
I'm certainly very interested in furthering that discussion on grad programs because of how the current situation that I'm situated in is in a college that is forming into primarily a graduate college, and that's the vast majority of students that we will be serving, and making sure that not all of the resources leave with the undergraduate program that our undergraduate college comes to be. But at the last institute last year, one of the things that we started was a discussion of defining quality and owning quality, and I think that would, it's hard to answer your question around admissions without facing the issue of selectivity and reputation, because I think, the reasons, there's probably multiple reasons, but one of the reasons behind why the admissions team is being so careful or nitpicky or challenging or difficult in this situation is, how is this going to affect our rankings, right? And so we started a conversation about what is quality, and David mentioned a little bit about how successful some of our programs are, but defining what we mean by success, agreeing on that as a collaborative, and then getting the word out about how we define success for non-traditional students, so that can become an accepted value that regardless of what institution you're at, depending on the demographic of students you're serving or depending on the students' your focus on selectivity is not the only thing, that it has to do with these other, other categories of success. So I'd like to see us continue that conversation and build on it.
Right. And it's a more productive way probably than going straight into admissions, which is what you really want to do, right? Yeah.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
I think on the other side of this issue too is the, and again, I don't have a lot of experience with really any in this area, but I know that, I mean, occasionally in my role, I'm given information to sign off on a returning student who comes with one of those sorts of records, right, that and in the conversations that I have with advisors, so this person these folks have already made it past admissions and subsets and it's reached the D level. There's also a real concern to make sure that these folks are paying out of pocket and nobody wants them to end up leaving with debt and unsuccessful, right? And so I think that there's probably lots of cases that I think people are referring to in which, we're putting unnecessary obstacles in front of people. But I think there's also a lot of very conscientious folks who are trying to also look out for folks who maybe will end up coming and not being successful at all and in debt. So,
Yeah, thank you.
just the other side.
Yes.
We seem to know a lot of the roadblocks. We know them in admissions, policy, curricula. We know the problems, don't we? I mean, we have enumerated them. We talked about language of a university saying we're going to be transformative, and yet still got to wait and see, right? What does that really mean? We understand that adult education is not just about age, that it affects traditional and non-traditional, it opens up our consciousness. One thing we know also is what I think you said, Michelle, somebody, that how many people in this room, there are a whole bunch more like us. We are not unique who are thinking like that. And they're right there in our institutions. And sometimes we live in silos. Mm-hmm. You spoke to it. Mm-hmm. It's more than just getting people together. But one of the things, I just saw the Charles White Museum and all that, and it reminded me of how we got to this table, right? And we did it by organizing. Old style organizing. In admissions, there's somebody who's concerned about that. Maybe 5 people. I'm telling you, it means that we can't sleep a lot. But I'm talking about old style organizing. I think that that's what you all did with this great college for the new maturity, right? Not the minority, the new majority. You organized us to come here. It is incumbent upon us to go to that policy meeting that this gentleman so well talked about, right? Because we have a policy that says if you don't have 90 credits, you can't come to Tacoma Evergreen. So I asked the provost about that, and she says, yeah, we need to change that. And yeah, we're going to change that, but I want to put a lot of work on the staff. I thought you were going to put a lot of work on the staff. What? So that is something we need to bring staff and people together. I bet there are some, I hate to use the word revolutionary, but I'll use it, folks, minded people whose consciousness is where you are. Unless we get those folks together, we cannot change anything. We cannot live in these silos. We know the problem. And we can become more and more familiar with the problem as we have these kinds of meetings, right? I mean, I want to go home with hope. You know what I mean? I want to go home hearing this gentleman say that, my God, there are 5 people in admissions that probably would want to sit down and talk about, maybe you don't have to go to the meeting, but maybe. People don't realize sometimes of the possibilities. We have just enough time. So I can't remember who said this, starting now, right? And now it just seems so faded and gone right now. sorry. But policy has to change, because we are here for systemic change, are we not? And for change in our local and national environments, right? We want to change this world, right? How do we do that? Is because we're not unique. There's a whole bunch of guilders out there. There's a whole bunch of folks who are thinking the same thing about that, about policy. We have to get together with them. We have to sometimes stay up late at night to do this. I mean, this is it. I mean, just look in a kid's eye and figure that out. That's all I'm saying.
So Gilda, I think Gilda's taking us home for the evening, but I just want to elaborate on that just a little bit, because I went through the surveys today and just kind of gathered for myself what I found. And the easiest one was the hopes that people brought, because it was pretty common that folks wanted to connect, they wanted to share, and they wanted to learn from each other. People feel a little isolated, and they wanted to spend time learning and connecting with each other. The challenges, there were like 4 categories. We kind of cover most of them. Institutional challenges, the challenges students bring with them, systemic challenges, and the challenges of instruction. So that's a pretty neat package. The strengths all over the place. So there's your hope. We got so many strengths, I can't even put it in nice little buckets. So, looking forward to seeing you all tomorrow, 9 a.m. at National Lewis. So not back here, but just down on Michigan Avenue. He's going to come to the 2nd floor to check in, and then we'll be on the 3rd floor.
I'd like to piggyback one more thought, which is just to note that this meeting, and especially with our new colleagues, is a sign of what Gilda was talking about. That 2 years ago, we had a small group of programs. Last year, Johnson C. Smith and National Lewis joined us. For some wonderful accidental reasons, our work got kind of publicized a bit, and suddenly there was all kinds of energy of people who were doing great work, who wanted to connect. So we are already in the middle of this organizing process, and we need to think by the end of the week, what's the next step? How do we do it?
Thank you very much. Have a lovely night.